Still, I stood alone in my kitchen, gripping the used mug my own daughter handed me for Father's Day, hours after she surprised another man with a luxury vacation. As I kept my voice steady and my face calm, the cracked ceramic burned in my hand like a quiet insult I wasn't meant to question. While the house slept, my phone lit up beside that same mug. The bank alert, confirming my daughter had been moving money without me. The same mug sat there as I realized she hadn't just replaced me as a father, she'd reduced me to an obstacle. That's when the shock settled into clarity. This wasn't disrespect. It was a financial betrayal from my own child. Still, staring at what she thought I was worth, I made my decision. I wouldn't confront my daughter. I'd let the freeze speak for me. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. David woke to sunlight filtering through the tall bedroom windows, pale and quiet, the kind of morning that usually made him reflective. Father's Day had never been loud in his house. No balloons, no surprises, just small gestures that carried weight if you let them. He padded downstairs, coffee already on his mind, when he noticed a mug sitting alone on the kitchen counter, placed deliberately in the center like an offering. It was old, scratched, a faded company logo barely visible on the side. The handle was chipped. Inside, it was a folded note in Natalie's handwriting. "Happy Father's Day, Dad." That was it. No card, no explanation. David turned the mug in his hand, recognizing it immediately. It was something she must have grabbed from the back of a cabinet, maybe something she didn't want anymore. The realization landed softly at first, then settled heavier in his chest. By mid-morning, the family gathered in the backyard. The table was set. Laughter drifted easily through the warm suburban air. Franklin Davis arrived last, dressed casually but expensively, his presence filling the space the way it always did. Natalie greeted him with an enthusiasm David hadn't felt directed at him in years. When the gifts came out, Franklin's was presented with ceremony, a sleek envelope, thick, intentional. Inside was a luxury vacation package, first-class flights, a private resort. Natalie beamed as Franklin laughed, genuinely touched. David clapped along with everyone else, forcing his smile to hold. He felt foolish for even comparing the two moments, but the contrast was impossible to ignore. A used mug for him, a dream vacation for someone else. He told himself it didn't matter, that gifts were symbolic, that he was too old to feel slighted by something so small. Yet the sting lingered, sharp and unwelcome. Natalie caught his eye eventually. She walked over, still smiling, her tone light. "You liked it, right?" she asked, nodding toward the mug now sitting near his plate. "I thought it was simple, practical." David nodded slowly. He said thank you. He meant it, in the way people mean things. When they don't want to start a conversation, they're afraid won't end well. Natalie squeezed his shoulder and moved on, already distracted, already elsewhere. As the afternoon wore on, David found himself retreating inward. He watched Natalie laugh with Franklin, leaning in, listening, engaged. He tried to remember the last time she had looked at him that way, curious, warm, open. His mind drifted backward, uninvited, to long nights at the office, deals that couldn't wait, promises of later that had stacked up quietly over decades. He had built everything he owned from nothing, believing stability was love, believing provision was presence. A memory surfaced with uncomfortable clarity. His own father, sitting at the kitchen table late at night, suit jacket still on, eyes tired, words few. A man who showed love through endurance, not affection. David had sworn he'd be different. Yet here he was, decades later, standing in the same emotional distance, watching it repeat itself with his daughter. When the gathering thinned and guests began to leave, David lingered behind, rinsing dishes he didn't need to wash. The mug sat in the sink, water pooling inside it. He stared at it, longer than necessary. Natalie passed behind him, thanked him again for everything, kissed his cheek quickly, already halfway out the door. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words didn't come. That evening, alone in his study, David turned the mug over in his hands once more. The house felt too quiet. He told himself he was overthinking, that this was just another Father's Day, that relationships evolved. Still, an unease settled deep in his gut. Something about the day felt off, misaligned, like a warning he couldn't quite name. He placed the mug on his desk, untouched, and sat back in his chair, staring at the darkened window. For the first time, David wondered not what he had given his daughter, but what he might have already lost. The rest of Father's Day drifted by in fragments for David, moments stitched together by noise and motion, but never fully landing. He sat among his family on the back patio, listened to conversations overlap, watched plates fill and empty, yet felt strangely removed from it all. The earlier sting hadn't faded. It had settled deeper, dull, and persistent. Every laugh seemed just a little too loud, every smile slightly rehearsed. David nodded when spoken to, smiled when expected, but his thoughts kept pulling him inward. Natalie moved through the afternoon with practiced ease. She checked in on him just enough to appear attentive, asking if he needed anything, commenting on the weather, the food, the neighbor's new landscaping. But none of it lingered. Her eyes slid away quickly, as if she were afraid that staying too long might invite a conversation she didn't want to have. David noticed how often she found reasons to cross the yard, to refill a drink, to join another cluster of voices. The closeness, he remembered from years ago, felt replaced by something polite and distant. Dinner was served just as the sun dipped low, the table crowded and warm with candlelight. Franklin took the center effortlessly, telling stories the way he always did, animated, self-aware, perfectly timed. He spoke about trips he'd taken with Natalie and Adam, little moments that painted a picture of shared experiences David had never been part of. Natalie laughed easily, leaning toward Franklin as he spoke, her hand resting comfortably on Adam's arm. Adam smiled, chiming in now and then, relaxed in a way David had rarely seen around him. David listened quietly, cutting his food slowly, the rhythm deliberate. He couldn't remember the last time Natalie had told a story that included him so naturally. The table erupted in laughter more than once, and each time David joined in a beat late, his chuckle landing after the moment had already passed. He felt like a guest at his own table, present but unnecessary. As the evening wound down, goodbyes stretched out in the driveway. Hugs were exchanged. Promises to get together again were made without dates attached. When the last car pulled away, the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise had been. Natalie thanked everyone, kissed David's cheek again, and told him she'd call soon. Then she was gone. Later that night, the house dark and still, David sat in the living room scrolling idly through his phone. He wasn't looking for anything in particular when a new email notification appeared. The sender's name made him pause. Simon Goldstein, Natalie's financial advisor. The subject line was dry and professional, but something about seeing it sent a small jolt through him. He opened it slowly. The message referenced a statement review and flagged irregular activity in Natalie's accounts, phrased carefully, neutrally. Nothing accusatory. Nothing definitive. Just enough to suggest that something needed clarification. David frowned, rereading the lines. Natalie had always been careful, methodical. She'd inherited that much from him, at least. He closed the email and leaned back, telling himself it was probably a routine error. Advisors sent these things all the time. Automated systems flagged harmless anomalies. There was no reason to jump to conclusions. He locked his phone and set it on the table, determined not to let it spoil the night any further. But the unease didn't leave. It followed him upstairs, lingered as he changed, sat beside him when he eventually retreated to his office instead of going to bed. The room smelled faintly of old books and polished wood, familiar and grounding. David sat at his desk, the only light coming from a shaded lamp, and let the quiet settle around him. He thought about Natalie as a child, how she used to sit on that same desk, swinging her legs while he worked late, asking questions about things she didn't yet understand. He thought about when those visits stopped, replaced by closed doors and independence he'd encouraged without realizing what it might cost. David stared at the dark computer screen, the email replaying itself in his mind. A mistake, he told himself again. Still, the doubt pressed in, subtle but insistent. Somewhere between the chipped mug, the laughter at dinner, and that unexpected message, a pattern seemed to be forming, one he couldn't yet see clearly, but couldn't ignore either. David woke before his alarm, the pale gray light of early morning seeping through the curtains. For a few seconds, he lay still, disoriented, his mind hovering between sleep and memory. Then his phone vibrated on the nightstand. Once, twice. He reached for it, irritation already forming, until he saw the notification banner stretching across the screen. Account notice. Access restricted. His chest tightened. He sat up, reading faster now, as more messages loaded, automated alerts, formal language, unmistakable in meaning. Natalie's bank accounts had been frozen. All of them. The word frozen echoed in his head. Cold and final. This wasn't a delay or a glitch. This was an intervention. David swung his legs over the side of the bed, pulse climbing as he scrolled. Timestamps from early morning. Compliance review. Pending investigation. He didn't bother getting dressed before calling her. The line rang twice before she answered. "Dad," Natalie said, her voice even, almost tired, too calm. "Do you know what this is?" David asked, skipping any greeting. "Your accounts, they've been frozen. Every one of them." "I know," she replied. No surprise, no confusion, just acceptance. "That's it?" His voice rose despite himself. "Natalie, this doesn't just happen. Banks don't freeze accounts without cause." There was a pause on the line, measured. "It's a misunderstanding," she said. "My advisor is handling it." David stood and began pacing the bedroom. "A misunderstanding doesn't lock you out of your money overnight. What aren't you telling me?" "You're overreacting," she said quickly. Too quickly. "Please don't turn this into something it's not." After the call ended, David stared at his phone, unsettled. He wanted to believe her. He needed to. Natalie had made mistakes before, poor judgment, impulsive decisions, but nothing like this. Nothing that suggested criminal scrutiny. He told himself there had to be an explanation. Some clerical error. Some overly aggressive compliance review. Still, his instincts wouldn't quiet. By mid-morning, David was in his study, tie loosened, legal pad filled with names and numbers. He began making calls, former colleagues, financial officers, people who owed him favors or respect. The conversations were brief, cautious. One contact confirmed there had been unusual movement through Natalie's accounts. Another mentioned transactions routed through intermediaries David didn't recognize. Nothing definitive, but enough to unsettle him. "Off the record," one man said carefully. "It looks messy." David hung up and rubbed his temples. Messy wasn't a word he associated with Natalie. She had been raised around contracts and audits, had listened to dinner table conversations about risk and compliance since she was 10. She knew the rules. She had grown up watching him navigate them with precision. He called her again. This time, she sounded irritated. "I told you Simon is fixing it," she said. "You don't need to call half of Chicago." "I wouldn't have to if you'd tell me the truth," David snapped. "Who are these other parties, Natalie? These companies?" Silence stretched longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was carefully neutral. "They're business contacts. Expansion opportunities. Why didn't you mention them before?" "I didn't think it mattered." David closed his eyes. The way she said it, flat, rehearsed, made something inside him sink. This wasn't panic. This wasn't confusion. This was containment. Like she was following a script. After the call, David pulled up everything he could access. Public filings, transaction summaries his contacts had forwarded, incomplete, but troubling. Shell names, foreign-linked LLCs, amounts large enough to draw attention. His hands trembled slightly as he scrolled, the scale of it slowly coming into focus. This wasn't accidental. It wasn't small. By late afternoon, the house felt too quiet. David sat alone at his desk, staring at a web of connections he didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. The image of Natalie from the day before, smiling, composed, handing him that chipped mug replayed in his mind with new meaning. He wondered how long she had been carrying this, how long she had been lying. The thought hit him harder than the fear. She hadn't come to him, not once. As evening shadows crept across the room, David leaned back in his chair, the weight of the realization settling in. Whatever Natalie was involved in, it was serious. And for the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that his daughter wasn't just caught in something dangerous. She might be responsible for it. The law office overlooked downtown Chicago, glass and steel stretching toward a gray sky that felt heavier than it should have. David sat across from his attorney, hands folded, posture rigid, listening as if distance might soften the words. It didn't. The explanation was calm, precise, and devastating. The accounts weren't frozen by mistake. They had been flagged due to patterns consistent with money laundering, layered transfers, shell entities, funds routed through jurisdictions designed to obscure origin. David stared at the polished table as the terms stacked up, each one pressing harder than the last. This wasn't speculation. It was procedure. The kind that came after red flags had already been raised. "Is she being charged?" David asked quietly. "Not yet," the lawyer said. "But this is serious, and it's not isolated." David left the building with a tightness in his chest that refused to loosen. He drove straight to Natalie's apartment, the city blurring past him, memories colliding with facts he didn't want to accept. When she opened the door, her expression was guarded, already braced for impact. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He laid out what he knew, carefully, methodically, the way he always handled problems. Natalie listened with crossed arms, eyes hardening with every sentence. When he finished, she shook her head. "You don't understand," she said. "I'm being targeted. This happens to people who try to grow too fast. Someone wants to make an example out of me." "Who?" David asked. "Name them." She looked away. "I can't. That's not an answer." Her tone sharpened. "Neither is assuming I'm a criminal." The word hung between them, ugly and unavoidable. David searched her face for something: fear, regret, honesty, but found only resistance. She insisted it was a misunderstanding, that advisors had assured her it would be resolved. She offered nothing concrete, no timelines, no names, no explanations that held up under scrutiny. The more David pressed, the more defensive she became. Eventually, she accused him of not trusting her, of always expecting the worst. The conversation spiraled, ending not with resolution but exhaustion. David left knowing less than when he arrived. Over the next 2 days, he dug deeper. Not through Natalie she had shut down, but through records, contacts, and quiet inquiries. What he found chipped away at his remaining hope. The transactions were too deliberate, the entities too carefully layered. This wasn't naivety, it was participation. What unsettled him even more was Adam. Natalie's husband seemed oddly detached from the crisis. When David called, Adam sounded inconvenienced rather than alarmed. He spoke about lawyers and timing, not consequences. When David asked whether he knew about the accounts, Adam shrugged it off, said Natalie handled her own finances. There was no urgency in his voice, no concern for his wife's freedom or future. It felt wrong. David began to suspect that Adam knew more than he was saying, or worse, that he had always known. The distance, the indifference, the way he avoided specifics, it all fed a growing sense of unease. Running out of options, David made a call he never thought he'd need to make. Detective Kate Miles listened without interruption as David laid everything out, his voice steady but strained. When he finished, there was a pause on the line. "You're not alone in this," she said finally. "There's a broader investigation underway. Financial fraud, high net worth individuals, complex structures designed to move money quietly." David's grip tightened on the phone. "Is Natalie a target?" "She's a node," Kate replied. "One of several." The word hit him harder than any accusation. A point in a network. Not incidental, not invisible. Connected. Kate explained that authorities were tracking patterns that linked business leaders, advisors, and family members across multiple states. The scope was expanding. And once names surfaced, they didn't disappear easily. When the call ended, David sat in silence, the city humming beyond his window. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened glass, older, wearier, suddenly unsure of the ground beneath his feet. This wasn't just about Natalie anymore. It was about proximity, reputation, legacy. He had spent a lifetime building something stable, believing control equaled safety. Now, the actions of his own daughter threatened to unravel it all. And as the truth continued to surface, one thought refused to leave him. Whatever Natalie had stepped into, it was far bigger and far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Detective Miles called just after sunrise. David was already awake, seated at the kitchen table with untouched coffee, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the space. He answered on the first ring, bracing himself. "The scope has widened," Kate said without preamble. "We've identified transactional overlap between Natalie's accounts and several entities tied to people you know. Business contacts, former partners." David closed his eyes. The word overlap landed like a verdict. He had spent decades building a reputation on clean lines, clear ownership, documented flows, nothing that couldn't withstand scrutiny. The idea that his name might now be adjacent to fraud, even indirectly, made his stomach turn. "Am I a subject?" he asked. "Not at this point," Kate replied. "But proximity matters. And there's more." She hesitated, just long enough for dread to settle in. One of the names that keeps resurfacing is Franklin Davis. David felt the breath leave his lungs. Franklin charming, well-connected, effortlessly trusted. The man Natalie adored. The man who had sat at his table, laughed with his family, accepted that extravagant Father's Day gift without a flicker of discomfort. What role? David asked quietly. We're still confirming, Kate said. But the pattern suggests influence, access, possibly using Natalie's ventures to move money without drawing attention. Using her. David ended the call and sat in silence, the pieces rearranging themselves in his mind. The vacation, the closeness, the way Natalie deferred to Franklin's advice. The idea that his daughter might have been steered, manipulated, made his anger spike, hot and immediate. He didn't call ahead. He drove straight to Franklin's house, each mile tightening the coil in his chest. When Franklin opened the door, he looked surprised, then guarded. David didn't waste time. He laid out the facts as he knew them, naming accounts, entities, timelines. Franklin listened, arms crossed, expression unreadable. When David finished, Franklin shook his head slowly. You're seeing ghosts, he said. I've done nothing illegal. Then why does your name keep surfacing? David shot back. Franklin smiled, thinly. Because people like us are always connected, David. You know that. Money moves. Families overlap. That doesn't make it criminal. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. And sometimes things in families aren't what they seem. The remark lingered, unsettling in its implication. David searched Franklin's face for remorse, or fear, or truth. He found none. Just confidence, and something colder beneath it. Driving away, David felt no relief, only a deeper sense of entanglement. That feeling intensified when Adam called later that afternoon. The conversation deteriorated quickly. Adam bristled at questions, deflected responsibility, insisted Natalie had acted independently. His defensiveness bordered on hostility. Why are you interrogating me? Adam snapped. I didn't force her to do anything. No, David replied evenly. But you benefited. Silence followed. Too long. When Natalie was taken in for questioning that evening, the call came from a number David didn't recognize. He arrived at the station just as she was being escorted down the hallway. Wrists uncuffed but guarded, her face pale with contained fear. For a moment, his anger threatened to overwhelm him. Anger at the lies, the recklessness, the damage. But when Natalie looked up and met his eyes, something else took hold. She was still his daughter. He didn't speak. He simply nodded, a small gesture meant to anchor her. She nodded back, barely. Hours later, David sat alone in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel, replaying the day in fragments. Franklin's denial, Adam's evasion, Natalie behind glass. The realization settled slowly, crushing in its weight. This wasn't a single bad decision. It was a web, and his family was trapped inside it. For the first time in his life, David had no clear move forward. Protecting Natalie might destroy everything he'd built. Walking away might destroy her. As the station lights reflected off the windshield, David stared ahead, knowing only this, whatever came next, would demand a choice he wasn't ready to make. The days that followed closed in on David from every direction. Natalie's legal situation escalated quietly, but relentlessly. Meetings with attorneys, sealed documents, careful language that never quite answered the questions he asked. Phone calls from business associates slowed, then stopped altogether. Invitations were rescinded. Conversations ended faster than they used to. David felt the shift unmistakably. He had gone from respected to risky, from trusted to avoided, without anyone saying it out loud. At home, Becky watched it happen with growing concern. One evening, as David stood at the kitchen counter staring at a stack of unopened mail, she placed her hand over his. You can't carry this alone, she said gently. And you can't save Natalie by destroying yourself. David didn't pull away, but he didn't turn to her either. If I don't stay involved, she's alone in this, he replied. I won't let that happen. Becky sighed, the sound weighted with years of understanding how he worked. You're her father, she said. Not her shield, but David couldn't let go. Every instinct told him that stepping back now would be a betrayal of a different kind. Adam, meanwhile, remained an unanswered question. David tried repeatedly to get him alone, to talk without lawyers or tension mediating every word. Adam dodged calls, postponed meetings, responded with vague reassurances when cornered. When David finally confronted him outright, Adam shut down completely. "I'm not discussing this anymore," Adam said coldly. "You should focus on your own exposure." The comment lingered long after the call ended. Your own exposure. It wasn't concern, it was a warning, and it solidified what David had begun to suspect. Adam knew far more than he claimed. Running out of people he trusted, David hired a private investigator recommended discreetly by one of his last remaining allies. The investigator was methodical, patient, and unsettlingly efficient. Within days, he returned with findings that left David staring at the wall behind him, barely hearing the rest. Franklin Davis's fingerprints were everywhere, not directly, but strategically. Shell companies connected to Natalie's ventures. Funds routed through advisory firms Franklin had quietly influenced. It wasn't sloppy. It was elegant, designed to look like guidance, mentorship, family support. He used her position, the investigator said plainly, and her name. The implication cut deeper than any accusation. Natalie hadn't just been reckless. She had been positioned. David drove to Franklin's house that same night, anger sharpened by clarity. This confrontation was different, no patience, no room for deflection. He laid out the evidence piece by piece. Franklin listened without interruption, then leaned back, his expression almost sympathetic. "You're still looking at this like a businessman," Franklin said. "That's your mistake." "What does that mean?" David demanded. Franklin studied him for a moment. "Your daughter doesn't want to live in your shadow forever. She wants distance, independence, maybe even separation from your legacy, your expectations." David felt something inside him crack. "You exploited that." "I encouraged her," Franklin replied calmly. "There's a difference." The words hit harder than denial ever could have. Franklin wasn't apologizing. He was justifying. And worse, he was right about one thing David had avoided admitting to himself. Natalie had been pulling away long before the money. Long before the investigation. Driving home, David replayed every argument, every missed call, every moment he had assumed control with care. The legal crisis wasn't the root of the fracture, it was the result. Natalie hadn't just wanted success. She had wanted separation, and in trying to claim it, she had fallen into something far more dangerous. That realization didn't absolve her actions, but it reframed them. This wasn't just fraud. It was a collision between a daughter desperate to define herself and a father who never realized how tightly he was holding on. As David sat alone in his study later that night, surrounded by symbols of the life he'd built, a painful truth settled over him. The pressure bearing down on his family wasn't external anymore. It was coming from everything they had never said and everything they could no longer ignore. The indictment arrived without ceremony, a thick envelope delivered on an ordinary afternoon. Its contents anything but ordinary. Multiple charges, formal language, dates and figures laid out with unforgiving precision. David read the pages slowly, once, then again, as if repetition might dull the impact. Natalie's name appeared again and again, no longer attached to possibility or suspicion, but to certainty. The line between fear and reality had vanished. The news spread quickly. Calls came in from attorneys, risk managers, board members. Some spoke carefully, others not at all. David was urged quietly, firmly to distance himself, publicly, if necessary. His name still carried weight, but not immunity. Standing by Natalie now would not be seen as loyalty. It would be seen as complicity. That night, Becky sat across from him at the kitchen table, the indictment papers spread between them. She didn't argue facts. She argued love. "She's our daughter," Becky said, her voice steady but strained. "She's made terrible choices, but she's still ours. If we turn away now, what does that say about us?" David stared at the table, jaw clenched. "It says I won't let her destroy everything else," he replied, the words harsher than he intended. Becky reached for his hand. "Or it says you're punishing her for becoming someone you couldn't control." The accusation stung, because it wasn't entirely wrong. David felt torn in two between the father who remembered holding Natalie's hand on her first day of school and the man who had spent his life protecting a legacy built on discipline and order. Forgiveness felt like surrender. Walking away felt like betrayal of a different kind. As the days passed, Adam's role became harder to ignore. Subpoenas revealed communications David hadn't known, existed emails, approvals, quiet endorsements of deals Natalie had insisted were her own. Adam hadn't just stood by. He had enabled, benefited, and when pressure mounted, he had retreated, leaving Natalie exposed. The realization was infuriating. David saw now how carefully he'd been maneuvered, how appeals to family, to trust, had softened his scrutiny. Natalie's choices had been her own, but the framework had been built by others who knew exactly where her vulnerabilities lay. And yet, in the midst of the anger, something shifted. During a rare, supervised visit, Natalie finally stopped defending herself. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for rescue. She spoke quietly about feeling suffocated, about wanting to prove she could succeed without leaning on the winter's name, about how every achievement felt pre-labeled, every failure magnified. Money, she admitted, had been a means to an end: independence, control over her own life. David listened, truly listened, for the first time in years. The rebellion he'd framed as recklessness wasn't rooted in greed, it was rooted in distance, in a daughter trying to step out of a shadow that had grown too large. That understanding didn't erase the damage, but it altered its shape. David began working, methodically, to untangle his own name from the mess, cooperating where necessary, restructuring where possible. Some losses were unavoidable. Contracts dissolved, relationships cooled. Still, he pressed forward, not out of pride, but necessity. At the same time, he started showing up for Natalie in quieter ways. Legal support, consistent presence, no lectures, no ultimatums. Their conversations were careful, often halting, but real. The bond wasn't repaired, it was exposed, raw and uncertain, but it existed. Late one night, alone in his study, David looked at an old photograph on his desk, Natalie as a child, smiling without reservation. He wondered when that ease had disappeared, and whether he'd been too busy building a future to notice what it was costing them. The question lingered, unanswered. Because even as David tried to bridge the divide between them, he couldn't escape the fear that some distances, once formed, could never fully be crossed again. As the trial date closed in, David found himself waking in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, running the same question over and over in his mind. Even if Natalie survived this legally, could she ever truly make things right? The damage wasn't limited to court filings or frozen accounts. It had seeped into trust, reputation, and the quiet assumptions that once held their family together. David had spent his life believing that mistakes could be fixed with enough discipline and effort. Now he wasn't so sure. He prepared himself for the worst, not just prison time for Natalie, but the slow erasure of everything he'd built his company reduced to a case study in cautionary tales, his name whispered with skepticism instead of respect. Worst of all was the thought that he might lose his daughter anyway, even if she walked free, that this ordeal might harden her rather than humble her, push her further away instead of back toward him. The courtroom was colder than David expected. He sat behind Natalie as she took the stand, her posture stiff, her hands folded carefully in front of her. When she spoke, her voice didn't waver, but it lacked the confidence she once carried so easily. She didn't deny her involvement. She didn't shift blame where it didn't belong. She spoke about choices, bad ones, and about the fear that had driven her to keep going even when she knew something was wrong. David watched her closely. This wasn't the defiant daughter he'd argued with months earlier. This was someone stripped of illusion, exposed to consequence. When the prosecutor pressed her, Natalie didn't crumble, but she didn't deflect either. She acknowledged her role, admitted her failures, and spoke openly about her desire to reclaim control of her life without shortcuts. It wasn't absolution, but it was ownership. Then the trial took an unexpected turn. Jenna Davis was called to testify. David felt the room shift the moment she took the stand. Jenna had always existed on the periphery, sharp-eyed, observant, rarely revealing her full hand. Her testimony began cautiously, but soon she revealed information that rippled through the courtroom. Communications, advisory pressure, financial recommendations that had nudged Natalie toward specific entities and transactions. Details that reframed Natalie not as the architect of the scheme, but as someone steered by influence she hadn't fully understood at the time. David's attention snapped into focus. The implications were immediate. The prosecution adjusted its line of questioning. Defense counsel leaned in. The narrative changed, not to innocence, but to context. When the charges were reduced, David felt a release he hadn't allowed himself to hope for. Not relief too much had been lost for that, but possibility. Natalie wouldn't walk away untouched. There would be penalties, oversight, consequences that would follow her for years. But she would have the chance to rebuild rather than simply survive. As the trial concluded, David sat quietly, absorbing the finality of it. The damage wasn't undone. His business would never fully recover its former standing. Some relationships were gone for good, but the worst outcome, the complete destruction of his daughter's future, had been avoided. In the days that followed, David reflected on his role in Natalie's life. He saw now that protecting her had often meant controlling her, insulating her from failure instead of letting her learn from it. This moment demanded something different. Not rescue, not command. Support without ownership. When he finally spoke to Natalie after the verdict, their conversation was simple. No promises, no plans, just acknowledgement of pain, of mistakes, of the long road ahead. As David left the courthouse one last time, the weight on his shoulders felt different. Still heavy, but no longer crushing. The future remained uncertain, fragile even. Yet for the first time since Father's Day, he allowed himself a cautious hope, not that things would return to what they were, but that something more honest might take their place. The weeks after the trial moved slowly, measured not in headlines but in small, deliberate steps. Natalie's life narrowed to structure and accountability, mandatory meetings, financial oversight, community service that stripped away any illusion of privilege. Each obligation carried its own quiet humiliation, and David could see how it wore on her. Rebuilding a reputation wasn't about one public apology or a favorable ruling. It was about showing up again and again when no one was watching. David resisted the urge to intervene. It went against every instinct he had honed over decades. Instead of offering solutions, he listened. Instead of calling in favors, he let Natalie face the consequences of her choices. The distance was intentional, not cold, but respectful. For the first time, he treated her not as a problem to be solved, but as an adult responsible for her own future. One evening, weeks later, the family gathered for dinner. No extended relatives, no forced celebration. Just David, Becky, and Natalie around a table that had once hosted louder, easier nights. Conversation came in careful fragments at first, updates on work, mundane observations, pauses filled with the clink of silverware. No one pretended the past months hadn't happened. They acknowledged it without naming it, letting the weight exist without trying to lift it too quickly. Natalie spoke about her plans, tentative but real, courses she was taking, work she hoped to find. The tone was different, less defensive, more grounded. David listened without interrupting, asking questions only when invited. Becky watched them both, her presence steady, hopeful but cautious. Adam didn't attend. Neither did Franklin. Their absence was noticeable but not surprising. David had accepted that some fractures weren't meant to heal. Trust, once broken in certain ways, didn't regenerate simply because time passed. Letting go of those expectations felt less like defeat and more like clarity. After dinner, Natalie lingered as Becky cleared the table. She stood near the window, hands clasped, then turned to David. "I know this hasn't been easy," she said quietly. "I know I hurt you." David met her gaze, seeing exhaustion there, but also resolve. "I'm not proud of what happened," she continued, "but I'm grateful you didn't give up on me." He nodded, emotion tightening his throat. "Support doesn't mean agreement," he said. "It means believing you can do better." Natalie smiled faintly, the gesture fragile but sincere. Later that night, alone in his study, David reflected on how much had changed. The house felt different, quieter, but not hollow. He no longer imagined a clean return to what they'd been. That version of their relationship belonged to another time. What lay ahead would be slower, more honest, built on acceptance rather than expectation. Healing, he realized, wasn't about restoring the past. It was about creating space for something new to take shape. As David turned off the light and headed upstairs, the uncertainty remained. Natalie's path would be long. His role would require restraint instead of control. But for the first time in months, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a possibility, fragile, imperfect, but real. Detective Kate Miles didn't ease into the conversation. She never did. David met her in a quiet conference room downtown, the kind designed to feel neutral. forgettable. She placed a thin folder on the table between them, but didn't open it right away. "There's something you need to understand," she said. "Natalie's case doesn't exist in isolation." David stiffened. He had learned to recognize that tone measured, deliberate, the calm before something irreversible. "Go on." Kate slid the folder toward him. Inside were charts, timelines, names highlighted in careful ink. At the center of it all was a name David hadn't expected to see: Mark Allen. David felt the room tilt. Mark wasn't just a colleague. He was his closest business partner for over 20 years. They had built ventures together, trusted each other's judgment, covered for each other in boardrooms and negotiations. Mark knew his weaknesses, his habits, his blind spots. "You're saying Mark is involved?" David asked, his voice barely steady. "I'm saying he's connected," Kate replied. "Shell companies, advisory influence, strategic introductions. Enough to suggest coordination, not coincidence." She showed him the evidence, financial pathways that traced back to entities Mark controlled, communications that revealed intent disguised as opportunity. David studied the pages, searching for an alternative explanation, something benign. He found none. "If this is true," David said quietly, "then everything I've done for the last decade is compromised." Kate didn't contradict him. "Association matters," she said, "and whether you knew or not will be questioned." David left the meeting shaken, the weight of realization pressing down on him harder than anything that had come before. Natalie's actions had threatened his legacy. Mark's involvement threatened to erase it entirely. He confronted Mark that evening in his office, the city lights casting long shadows across the glass walls. Mark didn't pretend surprise. He listened, hands folded, eyes calculating. "Yes," Mark said finally. "I was involved." David's breath caught. "And Natalie?" Mark shook his head. "She was a conduit, not a collaborator. She thought she was expanding, growing. I gave her access. She didn't ask the right questions." "You used her," David said, anger flaring. "I used opportunity," Mark replied coolly. "The same way we always have." The words cut deep. Mark leaned forward then, his voice dropping. "You should be careful, David. If this goes public, people will look at everything. Deals we made, structures we signed off on. You won't come out clean just because your intentions were." It was a threat, thinly veiled but unmistakable. Silence, Mark implied, was mutual protection. David stood there, the implications crashing into him all at once. He had trusted Mark with his career, his reputation, his future, and now that trust was being weaponized. Driving home, David replayed the conversation, recognizing moments from the past that now felt different decisions he hadn't questioned. Shortcuts justified as efficiency, oversight delegated without scrutiny. He hadn't orchestrated the fraud, but he had benefited from systems that made it possible. The realization hollowed him out. Late that night, David sat alone, documents spread across his desk, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened window. Protecting his legacy would mean staying quiet, letting others take the fall, accepting that this was simply how the world worked. Facing the truth would mean exposure, loss, consequences he could no longer control. Natalie's downfall had felt like a crisis. This was something else entirely. This was the foundation cracking beneath everything he believed himself to be. As David closed the folder and turned off the lamp, one certainty settled in his chest. Whatever choice he made next wouldn't just define his future. It would decide who he really was. David didn't sleep that night. Mark Allen's words replayed on a loop, each sentence carrying a different weight now that the truth had surfaced. By morning, the choice in front of him felt unavoidable. There would be no quiet compromise, no private understanding that made this disappear. If he was going to live with what he knew, he had to hear Mark say it again, plainly, without threats or implication. They met in a private dining room of a downtown club they'd frequented for years. The familiarity made David uneasy. Too many deals had been celebrated here, too many assumptions left unchallenged. Mark arrived early, already seated, his confidence replaced by something tighter, more brittle. "You look like hell," Mark said, forcing a smile. "Save it," David replied, sitting across from him. "This is your last chance to tell me everything." Mark exhaled slowly, glancing toward the door as if measuring escape. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said. "You know how these structures start: efficiency, tax exposure, leverage. It snowballed, "And Natalie?" David asked. Mark hesitated. "She wanted growth, independence. I offered her access. I never told her what was underneath." David's hands curled into fists beneath the table. "You used my daughter to shield yourself." Mark leaned forward, voice urgent. "I'm asking you to be practical. If you go public, you burn everything. Your company, your reputation, what's left of it. If you stay quiet, I can help stabilize things. I still have influence. We can ride this out." The offer sat between them, ugly and tempting. Silence, in exchange for survival. David stood abruptly. "You're asking me to trade what's left of my integrity for comfort. I'm asking you to survive," Mark snapped. "And don't pretend you're clean. If this opens up, they'll come for both of us." That warning followed David out into the street, echoing louder with every step. Detective Kate Miles didn't soften her response when David relayed the conversation. "If you stay silent," she said, "you're no longer adjacent. You're complicit." "What about my company?" David asked. "My employees?" Kate met his eyes. "Every choice has casualties. The question is whether you're willing to be one of them." That afternoon, Natalie called. Her voice was unsteady, stripped of the defensive edge it once carried. She didn't minimize. She didn't excuse. "I trusted him," she said. "He promised me independence. Said I could build something that wasn't yours. I didn't ask enough questions." David closed his eyes as she spoke. The anger he'd carried for months softened into something heavier grief, mixed with recognition. Natalie hadn't just been reckless. She had been vulnerable, and someone he trusted had exploited that. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "For all of it." They met later that evening, sitting across from each other without lawyers, without agendas. The conversation was raw, uneven. David didn't absolve her. He didn't erase the consequences waiting ahead, but when he spoke, his voice was steady. "I forgive you," he said. "Not because this is over, but because you're willing to face it." Natalie nodded through tears. "I will. I promise. That's the condition," David continued. "You take responsibility. You make amends. No shortcuts." When they parted, David felt something shift, not relief, but resolve. By nightfall, his decision was made. He drafted statements, made calls he knew would change everything. There would be fallout, investigations, headlines that wouldn't be kind, but silence was no longer an option. As David looked out over the city one last time before sending the first email, he understood the cost of what he was about to do. Exposing Mark Allen would dismantle more than a partnership. It would set fire to the life David had built, and there would be no turning back once the truth was released. Once David crossed the line and chose truth over protection, there was no slowing the momentum. What began as damage control turned into something far more consuming. With Detective Kate Miles coordinating quietly behind the scenes, David reopened old files, revisited dormant partnerships, and scrutinized deals he had once approved without hesitation. Every familiar name now felt suspect. Every success carried a shadow. Kate's team mapped Mark Allen's financial footprint with relentless precision. What emerged was staggering. Shell companies layered inside holding groups, advisory firms that existed only on paper, nonprofits used as pass-throughs. The operation wasn't regional, it was national. Mark had embedded himself into legitimate enterprises, using respectability as camouflage, positioning trusted figures like David as unknowing buffers. Natalie's businesses sat inside that web like vulnerable entry points, young, ambitious, eager to grow. David saw it clearly now. Mark hadn't improvised. He had engineered. Natalie hadn't been recruited by accident. She had been chosen. When Kate laid out the full scope, David felt something close to vertigo. "He built this," David said quietly. "Yes," Kate replied. "And he did it patiently." The more evidence surfaced, the harder it became to separate Mark's crimes from David's own career. Several ventures they'd co-founded had been used as reference points, credibility anchors that allowed Mark's entities to pass scrutiny. David hadn't laundered money, but his name had opened doors that should have stayed closed. The realization was devastating. His life's work, the integrity he believed defined him, was now intertwined with a criminal enterprise he hadn't seen coming. Still, David pressed forward. He met Mark one final time. This time not in private clubs or familiar offices, but in a sterile conference room, Evidence spread across the table like an accusation made physical. Mark glanced at the documents, then laughed softly. "You really think you're innocent in this?" Mark said. "You signed off. You benefited. You just didn't ask questions." David's voice was steady. "That ends now." Mark's expression hardened. "If I fall, I don't fall alone. Remember that." The threat wasn't new, but this time, it didn't stop David. He walked out, knowing Mark would deny everything publicly, distort facts, weaponize ambiguity. That was expected. At home, Natalie struggled with the weight of what she'd learned. The betrayal cut deeper than legal consequence. She offered again to take responsibility, to shield her father from fallout. David refused. "This isn't yours to carry alone," he told her, "and it's bigger than both of us." He watched her wrestle with guilt, understanding too late how thoroughly she'd been manipulated. David felt the familiar urge to protect, but this time, protection meant honesty, not concealment. As investigators closed in, David stood at the edge of a reckoning he never anticipated. Exposing Mark would dismantle structures that had supported his success for decades. Remaining silent would preserve fragments of his reputation, but at the cost of his family's future. Late one night, surrounded by documents that told a story he wished weren't his, David accepted the truth he could no longer escape. His legacy was already compromised, not by exposure, but by proximity. The only question left was whether he would sacrifice what remained of his name to free his family from Mark's shadow or cling to reputation, while everything that mattered slipped away. As the investigation widened, pressure seeped into every corner of David's life. What had once been a unified front began to fracture under the weight of scrutiny and blame. Becky tried to be steady, but David could see the toll it was taking on her, the constant balancing act between standing beside her husband and shielding their daughter from being crushed by what was unfolding. Some nights, she sat quietly at the kitchen table, long after dinner, staring at nothing, as if searching for a version of their family that no longer existed. David and Natalie, paradoxically, grew closer. The shared burden of guilt drew them into difficult, honest conversations they'd avoided for years. David saw how the ordeal had aged her, how shame lingered behind her eyes even when she tried to stay composed. Natalie carried responsibility like a weight she couldn't set down, apologizing too often, questioning every decision she made. David reassured her when he could. But he felt the strain as well, knowing that his past blindness had helped create the conditions that trapped her. Adam, meanwhile, faded further into the background. He skipped meetings, offered excuses, responded to messages with delays that felt intentional. The chaos swirling around Natalie seemed to leave him untouched, as if he were watching from a safe distance. David noticed it more each day. The lack of urgency, the absence of outrage. It sharpened a suspicion he could no longer ignore that Adam hadn't been blindsided by any of this. He had known, or at least known enough. The tension between David and Becky finally broke into open conflict one evening. Becky insisted that Natalie needed compassion, not pressure, that accountability didn't require isolation. David argued back, his voice tight with frustration. "If she doesn't face this fully," he said, "she'll never grow past it." "She's already paying the price," Becky replied. "She doesn't need to lose her family, too." The words landed hard. David turned away, torn between fear of enabling Natalie and fear of losing her altogether. They slept in silence that night, backs turned, both exhausted by the same question neither could answer. The strain intensified when Jenna Davis inserted herself more forcefully into Natalie's decisions. She called often, offering advice that felt less like support and more like direction. Jenna suggested strategies that subtly shifted blame, hinted that Natalie taking full responsibility would spare others, Adam, Franklin, even David, from deeper consequences. Natalie listened at first, out of habit, but doubt crept in. "Why does it feel like you're pushing me forward?" Natalie asked her one afternoon. "Why does it always come back to me taking the hit?" Jenna's smile tightened. "Someone has to." When David confronted Jenna later, the exchange turned volatile almost immediately. Accusations flew. Jenna's composure cracked just enough to reveal something raw underneath. "You don't know what it's like," she snapped. "Watching your family's wealth dictate every room you walk into, being treated like an accessory to it." David stared at her, stunned. The resentment had been there all along, quiet, cultivated, waiting for leverage. The realization left him shaken. Jenna hadn't just been advising. She had been steering, nursing grievances that now threatened to tear what remained of the family apart. By the time David drove home, anger gave way to exhaustion. He felt cornered by forces he could no longer control: legal, emotional, familial. His business was unraveling. His marriage was strained. His daughter was fighting to reclaim her future while carrying scars he couldn't erase. Yet as fractured as everything felt, one truth anchored him. If he let the family splinter completely, there would be nothing left worth saving. Holding them together didn't mean fixing everything. It meant refusing to walk away. Late that night, David stood alone in the living room. Lights off, the house breathing quietly around him. He felt the breaking point approaching, not a collapse, but a reckoning. Whatever came next would demand more than strategy or strength. It would demand that he choose who he was willing to stand with when everything else continued to fall apart. Mark Allen's arrest broke across the business world like a controlled demolition. Headlines moved fast, speculation faster. David watched the footage in silence. Mark led from a building he once entered with confidence, cameras flashing, reputation evaporating in real time. Within hours, David's phone filled with calls he didn't answer, and messages that said too much by saying very little. By the end of the day, there was no ambiguity left. His company was under formal investigation. The impact was immediate and brutal. Clients froze accounts. Investors requested emergency meetings and then quietly withdrew. Projects that had taken years to build stalled overnight. David sat through tense conference calls where familiar faces avoided his eyes, where words like exposure and risk mitigation replaced trust. Employees he'd mentored for decades were suddenly collateral damage, their futures uncertain because of decisions made far above their pay grade. Walking through the office felt surreal. The hum of productivity had been replaced by a low, anxious murmur. People whispered when he passed, not out of malice, but fear. Fear that proximity to him might now cost them everything. David felt the weight of that more than any headline. This was the part no investigation captured, the human fallout. Natalie, watching the implosion from a distance she could no longer deny, made a decision that surprised even David. She stepped forward publicly. The apology was direct, unpolished, and deeply personal. She acknowledged her role, accepted responsibility, and offered what assets she had left toward restitution. There were no excuses, no qualifiers, just accountability. The backlash was unforgiving. Public sympathy was thin, drowned out by anger toward the Winters name. Natalie became a symbol of privilege, of betrayal, of systemic rot. David read comments he wished he hadn't, each one sharpening the realization that redemption, if it came at all, would not be quick. Then came Adam's filing. The divorce papers arrived without warning, citing irreconcilable differences. David read the document twice, feeling something cold settle in his chest. The timing was impossible to ignore. As Natalie's world collapsed, Adam had chosen distance, legal, emotional, strategic. David couldn't help but question whether Adam's attachment had ever been about partnership or simply proximity to security. When Natalie learned of it, she didn't cry at first. She sat quietly, absorbing the finality of it. Later, alone with David, the tears came not loud, but relentless. She spoke of guilt then, of how every decision she'd made now echoed outward, harming people she hadn't intended to hurt. For the first time, David saw her fully reckon with the consequences, not just the legal ones, but the personal cost. Amid the chaos, an anonymous message arrived in David's inbox. No subject line, no return address, just a series of references, dates, companies, communications that pointed toward a familiar name. Jenna Davis. David felt a chill as he read. The details suggested influence, manipulation, a guiding hand that had nudged events in subtle but decisive ways. It forced him to reconsider moments he'd dismissed before, conversations that now felt calculated, advice that steered blame away from certain people and toward others. Jenna hadn't been a bystander. She had been shaping outcomes. By the time night fell, David sat alone in his office. The city lights blurred beyond the glass. His business was unraveling. His reputation lay in pieces. His family was fractured, bruised by forces both internal and external. Everything he had built carefully, deliberately, was either gone or slipping through his fingers. And yet, beneath the exhaustion, something hardened. This was the bottom, the place where illusions burned away, and only choices remained. David understood now that there was no salvaging the old version of his life, no return to what had been. As he shut down his computer and reached for his coat, one question followed him out into the night: whether he would let this collapse define him, or whether he would find a way to rebuild from the ashes, even if it meant burning what little remained of his former world to do it. David had begun to think the worst was behind him. Not finished, never finished, but exposed. The investigation had names now. Structures, endpoints. For the first time since everything collapsed, he allowed himself to sketch the outline of rebuilding, downsizing the business, settling liabilities, protecting what little stability remained for Becky and Natalie. It wasn't optimism. It was survival. Then the truth surfaced. It came not as a single revelation, but as a pattern documents cross-referenced late at night. Timelines aligning too cleanly. Decisions Natalie had made that suddenly felt guided rather than impulsive. The anonymous tip about Jenna Davis resurfaced in David's mind, no longer an outlier but a thread. When Detective Miles confirmed what her team had uncovered, David felt the ground shift beneath him. Jenna hadn't been circling the scheme. She had been running it. Years of quiet influence unfolded under scrutiny. Emails framed as advice. Introductions disguised as support. Deals presented as empowerment. Jenna had positioned herself as Natalie's ally, someone who understood what it meant to live adjacent to the Winters fortune without fully benefiting from it. She spoke the language of resentment fluently, nurturing Natalie's desire for independence while steering her toward increasingly compromised decisions. She was grooming her, Kate said plainly. Not for success, for use. The motive was as calculated as it was cruel. Jenna had watched the Winters family from the inside for years. David's authority, Natalie's future, the wealth that moved effortlessly where she never could. Jealousy hardened into strategy. She didn't want to share. She wanted control. David requested one meeting before the warrant was executed. He needed to hear it from her. Jenna arrived, composed, impeccably dressed, as if this were just another family discussion. When David confronted her with the evidence, she didn't deny it. She smiled. "You always underestimated me," she said. "All of you did." David's voice shook, despite his effort to steady it. "You destroyed my family." "No," Jenna replied coolly. "I exposed it. You built a system where power and money decided worth. I just learned how to redirect it." She spoke openly then of shell companies already dissolved into offshore layers, of assets moved beyond easy recovery, of contingencies prepared long before Mark Allen's arrest. Natalie's businesses had been the perfect vehicle, credible, ambitious, shielded by David's reputation. "I planned this from the inside," Jenna said without hesitation. That was the only way it could work. The confession hollowed David out. Every moment of trust, every dismissed doubt, replayed with brutal clarity. Jenna hadn't just betrayed them financially. She had weaponized family. Natalie, when David told her, broke in a way he hadn't seen before. Not loud grief, quiet devastation. The realization that her hunger for independence had been manipulated cut deeper than any charge or headline. She had believed she was choosing her own path, only to learn it had been engineered. David didn't hesitate this time. He contacted Detective Miles immediately, handing over everything: statements, recordings, corroborating documents. Jenna's arrest came swiftly, methodical, and unceremonious. No press conference. No spectacle. Just the quiet removal of a mastermind who had assumed she'd never be touched. As Jenna was led away, she looked back once, not at David, but at Natalie. The look wasn't remorseful. It was satisfied, as if the damage itself had been the point. In the aftermath, David sat alone, the enormity of it settling slowly. His trust in people, his confidence in his own judgment, all of it had been compromised. The betrayal wasn't just external anymore. It lived in the spaces where certainty used to be. Yet beneath the wreckage, something else took shape. Resolve. David had been reactive for too long, absorbing blows, mitigating fallout, choosing the least destructive option. That phase was over. Jenna's exposure didn't fix what had been broken, but it clarified the enemy. It gave shape to the chaos. He would rebuild not the empire he'd lost, but something cleaner, smaller, honest. And he would protect his family not through control, but through vigilance. As dawn crept in through the windows, David stood, exhaustion heavy in his bones, determination steadier than it had been in months. Everything he thought he understood had been shattered. But from the ruins of that final betrayal, one truth remained unbroken. He would not let anyone ever use his family again. Jenna's arrest didn't come with celebration. There were no speeches, no sense of victory, only a quiet finality that settled over David like a deep exhale he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The investigation moved forward methodically, piece by piece, dismantling what she had built. But the damage she'd left behind lingered. The Winters name no longer opened doors. It raised questions. That reality didn't disappear with handcuffs. Still, for the first time in months, David felt something close to closure. Not forgiveness, not relief. Just the absence of constant dread. Natalie embraced the consequences fully. She cooperated with law enforcement without hesitation, signing over records, authorizing asset seizures, returning funds that had passed through her accounts even when it meant walking away from everything she had once considered security. Each step forward cost her something tangible: pride, comfort, the illusion that mistakes could be undone quietly. David watched her endure it without complaint. The process stripped her down to essentials, forcing her to rebuild an identity not rooted in the Winters name or borrowed authority. She took a modest job. She lived smaller, and in doing so, she began to understand independence not as freedom from responsibility, but ownership of it. David faced his own reckoning. The business he once commanded was gone in all but name. What remained were debts, obligations, and a long road back from public skepticism. Starting over at his age wasn't romantic, it was humbling. He liquidated assets, cut staff he'd hoped to protect, and worked from a bare office with borrowed furniture. Every decision was scrutinized, every move documented. This time, transparency wasn't a talking point, it was survival. He rebuilt slowly, deliberately, rejecting shortcuts he once would have justified as efficiency. Contracts were simple. Structures were clean. He chose partners carefully, favoring character over convenience. The work felt different, less intoxicating, more grounded. And in that shift, David found something he hadn't expected: pride, unburdened by ambition. Becky remained his constant. She stood beside him through the long days and quieter nights, reminding him that rebuilding wasn't just professional, it was personal. They talked more now, about mistakes, about fears they'd never voiced when life had felt invincible. The crisis had stripped away pretense, leaving something sturdier in its place. Their marriage didn't return to what it had been. It evolved, less performative, more honest. Natalie and Adam began speaking again, cautiously. The distance between them remained, shaped by wounds neither pretended had healed. They met for coffee, talked logistics, apologized without expectation. There was no illusion of restoration, only acknowledgement. Natalie understood now that independence meant standing even when support wasn't guaranteed. Whether their marriage survived or not, she would no longer define herself through it. As months passed, David's new venture found its footing. Clients came not because of reputation, but because of trust earned slowly. Each small success felt earned in a way his past victories rarely had. He wasn't rebuilding an empire. He was rebuilding himself. One evening, David stood outside his modest office as the sun dipped below the skyline. The city looked the same, but he wasn't. He thought of everything that had been taken and everything that remained. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was honest. For the first time in years, that felt like enough. As David turned the key and locked up, he understood he wasn't erasing the past. He was choosing not to live in it. And standing there, between what had been lost and what was still possible, he stepped forward, ready to take full responsibility for whatever came next. Recovery didn't announce itself with headlines or sudden wins. It arrived quietly, almost reluctantly. David's new venture gained traction, one client at a time. People drawn not by his former stature, but by his willingness to show his work, explain every decision, and admit what he no longer knew. Meetings were slower now, questions sharper. And yet, something unexpected happened. Trust followed honesty, not immediately, but steadily. He noticed it in small ways: a referral that came without hesitation, a contract signed after a long silence, clients who stayed not because they had to, but because they chose to. The business wasn't what it once was, and it never would be, but it was real, built without illusion. And for the first time in years, David felt present in it. Natalie's rebuilding was harder to measure. She worked consistently, kept her head down, followed every condition imposed on her. Professionally, Doors cracked open slowly, often closing again when her name resurfaced in background checks or online searches. Public memory proved stubborn. Apologies faded faster than headlines. David watched her absorb the rejection without complaint, learning that accountability extended far beyond the courtroom. When sentencing arrived, it was restrained but firm. Consequences without cruelty. Natalie accepted them without protest, her composure steady, even as the weight settled in. David sat behind her, hands folded, resisting the instinct to shield her from what she needed to face. Support, he'd learned, didn't mean interference. It meant presence. Outside the courthouse, Natalie finally let herself breathe. "This is mine to carry," she said quietly. David nodded. "And you won't carry it alone." At home, Becky and David found themselves in conversations they'd avoided for decades. They spoke openly about fear, about misjudgments, about how success had once insulated them from difficult truths. The crisis had stripped away assumptions, leaving something simpler and stronger behind. They learned to listen without fixing, to disagree without withdrawing. Their marriage deepened not through grand gestures, but through consistency, through showing up tired, through staying. As Natalie and David spent more time together, their relationship shifted again. Less guarded now, but still honest. They didn't pretend the past had been handled perfectly. They acknowledged missed signals, misplaced trust, unspoken resentment. Forgiveness wasn't a single moment. It was a practice, one that demanded humility from both of them. David began to understand that redemption wasn't transactional. It wasn't earned by correcting balance sheets or restoring reputation. It lived in awareness, in refusing to repeat the same mistakes, simply because they were familiar. He saw how easily he'd once equated control with care, certainty with strength. Letting go of those beliefs felt like loss at first. Then, slowly, like freedom. One evening, David sat alone after closing the office. Lights dimmed, the city humming outside. He thought about everything he'd chased: status, expansion, dominance, and everything he'd nearly lost because of it. The lesson wasn't that ambition was wrong. It was that unchecked ambition blinded him to people. Natalie called that night, not with a problem, but with news. A small promotion, a moment of progress she wanted to share. David smiled as he listened, pride settling in not because of what she'd achieved, but because of how she'd done it. When the call ended, David didn't linger on the past. For the first time, he felt no urge to defend it or rewrite it. The past had shaped him. It didn't own him. As he turned off the lights and locked the door, David accepted a truth that had taken him a lifetime to learn. Redemption didn't erase scars. It taught you how to live with them. And with that understanding, he stepped forward, not finished, not forgiven by everyone, but clear-eyed, grounded, and ready to keep walking the long road ahead. The invitation arrived quietly, without fanfare. A regional business conference. No headline slot. No flattering language about resurgence or comeback. Just a request. Would you be willing to speak about failure, rebuilding, and ethics? David read it twice before accepting. A year earlier, he would have declined. Now, he understood the value of telling the truth without polish. Standing at the podium weeks later, David scanned the room filled with younger faces, ambitious and alert. He didn't open with success. He spoke about collapse, about misplaced trust, about how easily numbers could blind you to people. The room was still as he described losing everything he thought defined him, and how rebuilding forced him to confront the parts of himself he'd ignored for decades. "My biggest mistake," he said, voice steady, "was believing my role as a provider excused my absence as a father." The words landed heavier than any balance sheet confession. When the applause came, it wasn't loud. It was sincere. Natalie watched from the back of the room. She hadn't asked to attend. David had simply told her where he'd be. Seeing him there, not defending, not boasting, just owning, felt like a closing of a chapter she'd lived inside for too long. Her own life had finally found its footing. Slowly, carefully, she had built something new, a modest venture, rooted in service, not scale. No borrowed credibility, no shortcuts. It wasn't flashy, but it was hers. That independence mattered more than financial security ever had. At home, David and Becky marked quieter milestones. A weekend away, a shared laugh that didn't carry tension underneath. They no longer avoided difficult conversations. They leaned into them. Their relationship had been reshaped by loss, but it had also been clarified. They knew what mattered now and what didn't. The family gatherings grew warmer, less cautious. Healing didn't erase memory, but it softened its grip. David saw his legacy taking form in unexpected ways, not in buildings or contracts, but in conversations that ended with understanding instead of distance. Mentoring became part of David's routine. Young entrepreneurs sought him out not for shortcuts, but for perspective. He told them what ambition cost when left unchecked, how integrity wasn't proven when things were going well, but when walking away was the harder option. He didn't present himself as redeemed, just honest. Natalie joined him in community work, speaking to people rebuilding after financial collapse. She didn't position herself as an expert, only as someone who had learned the hard way. Slowly, the Winters name stopped drawing automatic skepticism. Trust returned in increments, earned rather than assumed. One evening, David sat alone on the back porch, the air cooling, the house quiet behind him. He thought about the man he'd been certain, commanding, convinced legacy meant permanence. He understood now that legacy was fragile, shaped not by control but by care. What endured were the lessons passed on, the space he made for others to grow, the humility to admit when he'd been wrong. As the lights flickered on across the neighborhood, David allowed himself a moment of stillness. He hadn't rebuilt what he lost. He'd built something else entirely, something smaller, stronger, and far more honest. And for the first time, he felt certain that whatever came next, this legacy, quiet, hard-earned, and shared, was one worth leaving behind. The vacation wasn't extravagant. No luxury resort, no attempt to recreate what had been lost. Just a quiet coastal town where mornings arrived slowly, and no one recognized the Winters name. David chose it deliberately. Healing, he'd learned, didn't need spectacle. It needed space. They walked the shoreline together the first morning, the sand cool beneath their feet, the rhythm of the waves steady and indifferent to everything they'd survived. Conversation came easily now, not because the past was forgotten, but because it no longer dominated every pause. Natalie laughed at something small, unguarded, and David felt the moment lodge itself in his chest. It had been a long time since laughter hadn't felt like an interruption. Evenings were spent around a small table, meals simple, the kind that invited reflection. They talked about the past openly, mistakes, misunderstandings, choices they wished they'd made sooner. There was no blame left to assign, only context. Becky spoke about fear she'd carried quietly for years. David admitted how often he'd mistaken control for protection. Natalie listened, then shared her own truth, how ambition had once felt like escape, and how accountability had taught her what freedom actually meant. One night, as the sun dipped low and the sky softened into muted colors, Natalie cleared her throat. "I've been thinking about what comes next," she said. David looked up, attentive but careful not to lead. "I want to start something," Natalie continued. "A nonprofit for people who lose everything financially, who don't have safety nets, who don't know where to turn when the system collapses on them." She spoke with quiet conviction, not urgency. She explained her plan slowly: education, legal guidance, practical resources. No grand promises, just help where it was needed most. David felt a familiar instinct rise, the urge to advise, refine, protect. He let it pass. "That sounds meaningful," he said simply. Natalie smiled, relief flickering across her face. "It is, and it's mine." Later that evening, David and Becky sat alone on the balcony, the distant sound of waves filling the silence. Becky reached for his hand, her grip steady. "We made it through," she said softly. David nodded. "Not the way I imagined, but maybe the way we needed to." They didn't talk about vows or second chances. They didn't have to. The years ahead would require the same work the years behind them had: attention, honesty, patience. But there was no doubt left between them about where they stood. As the vacation drew to a close, David found himself watching Natalie more than he spoke to her. He saw purpose taking shape in her, not driven by rebellion or escape, but by service. She was no longer running from his shadow. She was standing in her own light. On their final morning, they packed quietly, the kind of silence that felt complete rather than awkward. As they loaded the car, David paused, taking one last look at the horizon. The past still existed. It always would, but it no longer dictated the future. Driving home, he felt a calm he hadn't known in years. Not relief, contentment. He thought about legacy not as something imposed, but something shared. Not wealth passed down, but values lived out. Resilience, accountability, grace earned through failure. As Natalie spoke animatedly from the back seat, outlining ideas for her nonprofit, David smiled to himself. Pride filled him not because she had succeeded, but because she had grown. The road stretched ahead, open and unremarkable. And for the first time, that was enough. They weren't going back to who they had been. They were moving forward together, aware and ready for whatever came next. Time did what force never could. It softened the sharpest edges, not by erasing what had happened, but by giving it context. David's new business never grew large enough to dominate headlines again, and that was precisely why it endured. In an industry obsessed with scale and speed, his firm became known for something quieter: perseverance, honesty, and the rare willingness to walk away from profit when integrity was at risk. Younger professionals spoke his name with respect not because he was powerful, but because he was transparent, because he had fallen publicly and chosen to stand back up without shortcuts. Natalie's nonprofit took longer to find its footing, but when it did, the impact was undeniable. She worked with people who had lost everything: small business owners, families blindsided by financial collapse, individuals drowning in shame they didn't know how to name. She didn't speak from a podium. She sat across from them, listened, and offered what she once needed herself: clarity, accountability, and a path forward that didn't require pretending the past hadn't happened. Redemption, she told them, wasn't permission to forget, it was the chance to rebuild with intention. David watched her from a distance, careful not to interfere. Pride came differently now. It wasn't loud. It settled quietly, the way certainty does when it no longer needs validation. Years passed, slowly, almost unnoticed. David and Becky grew older together in a rhythm that felt earned. Their conversations were unguarded now, shaped by memory rather than fear. They spoke openly about the years they nearly lost, about the illusions they once lived under. Regret surfaced sometimes, but it no longer ruled them. What remained was gratitude for survival, for growth, for the hard truths that ultimately brought them closer. The Winters family no longer chased the appearance of unity. They lived it. Gatherings were smaller, more intentional. Laughter came easily. Silence, when it appeared, was comfortable. They had weathered the storm not by denying it, but by walking through it together, scars visible and accepted. One evening, the family gathered for dinner at David and Becky's home. Nothing elaborate, just familiar dishes, warm light, and the steady presence of people who had chosen each other again and again. Natalie spoke about a recent success at the nonprofit. Becky shared a memory David had forgotten, but was grateful to be reminded of. David listened more than he spoke, content to let the moment unfold without guiding it. As the plates were cleared and conversation slowed, David leaned back and took it all in. This quiet, hard-won peace was the legacy he had never known how to build before. Not control, not wealth, trust, space, the humility to let others grow beyond him. He understood now that being a father wasn't about shielding the future or shaping it to his will. It was about preparing those you loved to face it without you standing in the way. David looked around the table, at faces marked by time and experience, and felt something settle firmly in his chest. Not relief, not triumph, completion. David looks at his family with pride, knowing that they've rewritten their legacy together, one built on love, trust, and redemption.